This is an event held jointly by the Sussex Humanities Lab and the Sussex Centre for the Study of Sexual Dissidence as part of the SHL's regular seminar programme, and has been organised and will be moderated by Joe Walton, who is a research fellow in the Sussex Humanities Lab and will introduce himself in due course before he speaks in just a moment. First, though, I'd like to introduce our two guests today who are kindly joining us by the magic of Zoom from, as far as I know, across the Atlantic. Amanda Phillips is an assistant professor in the Department of English and Film and Media Studies at Georgetown University and the author of Gamer Trouble, Feminist Confrontations in Digital Culture. They are also co-editor of Ada, a journal of gender, new media and technology, of the Queer Trans Digital Book Series published by the NYU Press, and the 2018 Game Studies special issue on queerness and video games. Bo Ruberg is an assistant professor in the Department of Film and Media Studies and a core faculty member for the graduate program in Visual Studies at the University of California, Irvine. They're also an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Informatics, where they co-run the CATS, Critical Approaches to Technology, and the Social Research Lab. They're the author of The Queer Games Avant-Garde and Video Games Have Always Been Queer, and the co-editor of Queer Game Studies, as well as being the co-founder and co-organizer of the annual Queerness and Games Conference. Now, I note that Amanda's biography invites both collaboration and troublemaking. So at this point, I hand over to Joe with considerable excitement, expectancy, and a certain thrilling trepidation. Joe.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, everybody, for coming. So what I would like to do is just two things really in my little presentation. And the first is to kind of break open the chat. So if we could, everybody here who feels comfortable so doing, just briefly say hi in the chat, introduce yourselves and say something about yourself, your background, your interests, if you have some connection with games, what is it that you're making, what is it that you're playing, if you're an academic, what is it that you're researching, what are you teaching, if you are a interdimensional assassin, who is it that you've been sent to target, and what are some of your vulnerabilities. So let's just take a minute or two and really try and fill up the chat with hellos and some information about who's here. And then the second thing I'd like to do is really kind of offer 4 scattered kind of provocations that are all responses to work by our 2 main speakers today. And these are really just in the spirit of trying to open up cans of worms, as well as being responses to snippets from their 2 recent books. They are kind of riffs on that moment in a game where you've been using some kind of tool, you've been using it on different elements in the game, and you realize that, oh, you can actually use the tool on itself, and maybe something interesting will happen when you do that. So it's a kind of four different iterations of that same conceptual move, opening up a can of worms, tangling the worms together, giving the worms their own little can openers and seeing what happens. And the first can of worms is gamification. So gamification, often understood as the use of game mechanics in an otherwise non-game activity. And a book that was really exciting for me when it first came out is Jane McGonigal's Reality is Broken, 2011. Thinking about gamification, thinking about things like the quantified self movement, games like Zombies Run, and thinking about quite admirably how these games showcase a enlarged sense of both the affects and the effects of gameplay. In other words, games having a varied emotional texture, going well beyond mere pleasure and boredom, and also games as a transformative agency in the world that can do much more than entertain, themes that I think prefigure some of the work of our 2 speakers today. But also, I think in McGonagall's work, I can't speak to her more recent work, but in this game, in this book, certainly, there is a certain kind of bound upness with a rather narrow imaginary, bluntly put, a kind of capitalist imaginary, maybe a heteronormative imaginary as well. So looking towards a more participatory, a more caring, a more sustainable capitalism, but nevertheless not as wide horizons as we might hope for. So this is a little snippet from Beau's book, Video Games Have Always Been Queer, talking about this fantastic game, Realistic Kissing Simulator, a game in which there are no opportunities to save, no checkpoints, no way to advance through levels, a game in which you simply kiss somebody and there's no goods or currency, no reward for playing well, no proper way of doing it. So it's a game that is thinking about how instrumentalities kind of infiltrate intimacy in good ways, but mostly probably in bad ways. So what happens when we put these two things together? That's the first provocation. What happens when we think about gamification, the affordance of any situation in the world to absorb play and rules and be transformed by play and rules? And when we think about gamification in an enlarged sense, capable of integrating games in all their queerness, forgetting about leaderboards and badges, thinking about gamification as a practice that might not only enact the governmentalities of metrification, but also critique and resist the use of metrics and game mechanics to standardize and to discipline us. And that got me to thinking about publics, and particularly this great quote from Amanda's book, Gamer Trouble, which talks about not only games, but the kind of metagames in which they're embedded, including the hegemonic anti-metagaming metagame that cuts video games out of their context, reducing them to opaque commodities with defined uses. And that got me thinking about, I guess, counter-hegemonic, anti-metagaming metagaming. In other words, how do we resist that? How do we transform that? How do we start thinking about games as little publics, counter publics we might call them? And how do we think about the publics in which they are embedded and in which they find their social life? So we might want to think about something like itch.io, the platform that was oriented towards the sharing of games, but now plays host to all kinds of zines and essays and experiments and works in progress and games that you're not meant to play, but meant to think about, all kind of mixing together in both commercial logic and punkier, ziny, more avant-garde logic as well. So how might games themselves be considered as little publics, maybe even little democracies? And what does it matter what kinds of publics those publics are in turn embedded in? And if we do think about them as democracies, what kind of democracies are they? Agonistic, effective, participatory, corrupt, noisy, thirsty, fun, and or no fun. A fruitful mess of mechanisms of disciplinarity, legitimation, expert elicitation, excitation, and mediation. And this got me thinking about this little bit from Video Games Have Always Been Queer. And it's the start. Video games have always been queer. Even games that appear to have no LGBTQ content can be played queerly, and all games can be interpreted through queer lenses. As important as queer representation is in games, how might we start thinking about games as participating in queer utopian imaginaries, giving us glimpses of worlds that we long for? But this is also something that we kind of often have talked about for many, many decades in utopian studies. And so I'm interested in what it is that's particular about games, and perhaps particular about the way games thematize rigidity and openness that might allow us to reconceive that kind of utopian glimpse. Munoz talks about queerness as something that is yet to come. We have never been queer. And this is true, but it is also true, as Beau puts it, that video games have always been queer. So there's a kind of really interesting temporal disruption there. And I wonder how that might be a lens on thinking about how we reimagine reimaginings. In other words, if the aesthetic, if cultural objects do sometimes offer us glimpses of another world, how do we kind of differentiate the various quality of those glimpses? Are some of those glimpses more useful as agency towards actually building those worlds than others? How do games help us see beyond the policing of desire and the policing of reality? But also, what about performativity and agency? And that took me to this kind of final provocation. And this is another little quote from Video Games Have Always Been Queer. I'm arguing here against the dominant assumption that video games should be first and foremost fun. Instead, I posit that games can and do engender a much wider, more challenging, and importantly, queerer range of emotions. And in the case of queer failure, these queer affective experiences may be intentionally incorporated into a game by its designers. So how do we think about this broader palette of affectivity and effectivity? And in particular, how do we think about failure and iteration? Failure and iteration, something that queer studies has thought about, and queer activism has thought about quite intensely in the recent past, in particular, including the reclamation of certain types of emotion, modes of behavior and feeling that have been denigrated, and saying to ourselves, maybe things like, I've put here, in the topsy world of queer study, maybe things like happiness and empathy and creativity, we suddenly find them to be playing for the other team, whereas we find ourselves in ebullient discomfort, making worlds with and as soulless scoundrels and songful sea monsters. So iteration and failure and openness and constant transformation, very much part of queer studies and queer activism, but also part, I think, of neoliberal discourse. So how do we evade the veneration of iteration that just says, well, we can do something and then we can fail and we can figure out how to do it better next time? How do we evade that veneration of iteration that merely favors whoever has the most resources to fail with? So those are my little provocations, and with pleasure and delight and excitement, I would like to pass over to our next speaker, who is Amanda.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. It's always great to be here in community with folks in this time of isolation. Particularly honored to be here in conversation with Bo Ruberg, one of my favorite colleagues and human beings. So, I hope this conversation will be really productive and fruitful for everyone involved. I put together just some quick, not so much provocations as kind of situating myself within the kind of work that I do and have done, particularly within my book, Gamer Trouble. And, I see a lot of familiar faces here, which is really great. And so some of you may be familiar with what I'm about to say. Others might not be. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's share the correct screen. Here we go. And for folks for whom, pronoun disclosure is important, I actually consider myself a pronoun anarchist. I'm comfortable with any and all pronouns, but people often like preferences. So in order of preference, they, he, she will work for me, but I am comfortable with whatever you'd like to use. You can get in touch with me at my email, amanda.phillips@georgetown.edu, or find me on Twitter at NazkaTheMad. So I just want to talk a little bit about my sort of, I don't want to say philosophy, but my sort of embodiment as an academic and where my journey has taken me in creating a book like Gamer Trouble, because it's been, as a trained queer and feminist scholar, we all know that the personal is political, is professional. And so I think it's really important to sort of like give a behind the scenes look at the book itself. Trouble was really my starting point, and the genesis of Gamer Trouble, goes back to really anxious days, of course, in graduate school, where I was worried, very much consumed with worry about doing academia wrong. And I feel like that's a feeling that will be familiar to a lot of folks, right? As a first generation college student, the child of, on the one hand, a police officer and a secretary, right? I had no sort of real entry into what academia meant. And so that's been an interesting part of my journey that I really didn't appreciate as a graduate student. And I'm glad to see more sort of conversations around first gen, coming up in the ether, as it were. I was also very concerned about doing theory wrong, right? Getting into trouble as a graduate student who didn't really know the ropes or what the university was in a way, but also someone who grapples with theory in really sort of laborious and difficult ways. I was very surprised to hear some of my colleagues call me a theory person, because it's something that I do not find very easy, right? It's not supposed to be easy, but something that's particularly difficult to wrap my head around. You'll notice in Gamer Trouble, I play a little bit fast and loose with theoretical orientations, and that is a sort of like intentional methodology that I'll talk about in a bit. Also, the question of doing game studies wrong. At the moment when I was coming into my own as a graduate student, it was sort of like prime, or maybe just at the resolution of narratology versus ludology, these sort of methodological wars that were happening in game studies that many of us with marginalized identities recognized as very gendered exchanges. And so, the idea that I wanted to sort of think about games from a feminist lens, from the training that I got, it was not really apparent to me where that work was happening and whether that work would be accepted if it were done. Of course, we're in a much different situation now. It was a much different situation then, but it was not visible to me in the way that it is now. And so, but that's sort of like a trouble that generated the kind of work that I was doing in this book. And finally, the question of like, how do you do justice right? And this I think about a lot in terms of the scholarly approaches that I'm using, whether scholarly work is something that can work towards justice. And of course, my choice of games, right? I'm firmly situated in the popular in terms of the work that I do. That's partially I don't want to say it's a matter of taste, because I do enjoy indie games, but I often find myself grappling with the popular as a sort of place where most of the people around me are getting their ideas about the world, right? And so, I am often sort of thinking about whether or not those are quote unquote the right games to play, and whether my position as an academic, particularly at an institution like Georgetown, is the right place to be trying to do justice work. The genealogy of trouble that I'm working with within the book comes from a bunch of different places, right? Of course, in the top right, you'll see an image from the civil rights movement in the US with US Representative John Lewis, whose very famous tagline was "Make good trouble," right? Encouraging us to get in trouble, to break the rules, to kind of force justice through misbehaving. Very similar to the concept of the feminist killjoy, which is most recognizable through the work of Sarah Ahmed, but is pretty ubiquitous across queer women of color feminist theorizing, right? The idea that, only misbehaving women make history or whatever. I'm going to misquote that. Theoretically, or in the academy, gender trouble is often the book that people think about when they think of trouble, right? So sort of exploring the performativity of identity, the instability of gender as a concept, and then of course this maps onto games for me through the instability of the concept of the gamer, and of all of the different sort of identities that we inhabit and negotiate in our everyday lives, but particularly in our negotiation with games as a system. Staying with the trouble, Donna Haraway's book, for me, again, also sort of embodied this ubiquitous feeling within other other theorists or specifically activists, women of color like Audre Lorde, and folks who encourage us to sort of like embrace conflict as an important part of making change. Donna Haraway, and you can see this, I recently reread the Cyborg Manifesto, which I hadn't read in a few years. And it's really, you can really see the sort of like origins of her encouraging us to stick with messiness and to stick with conflict, right? As something that we shouldn't necessarily avoid, but actually work through in productive ways, or else we're not going to get change, right? So all of these things are sort of rattling around in my head around video games, and thinking about like, you know, I'm a troublemaker, I'm not doing this right. So let's continue to do this the wrong way around books, right? So that turns into trouble as a method. One of the main things I was trying to accomplish in Gamer Trouble was citation provocation. And this is, you know, something that I was explicit about in the introduction to the book. I hope it's explicit throughout, but, you know, following folks like Sarah Ahmed, who talk about citation practices as building the walls of a discipline, and as really sort of like political acts. With Gamer Trouble, I was trying to cultivate a certain bibliography, a certain network, a certain affinity with folks who are influencing the way that I think about games. I expected that to upset people in of course, like a troublemaking way. And so, you know, there it is. That's one of the things that I'm doing. I'm also working from a place of messiness, right? Of identity as a white and Latinx person of Mexican descent, as a queer, non-binary, transmasculine person, and, you know, as someone who's inhabiting the academy from a location that I probably ordinarily would not. I really think about my location as being really messy, and I'm interested in how messiness in identity plays across different works. Of terminology, of course, I mentioned, and this is apparent, especially when I talk about things like the male gaze, and thinking about how to sort of scramble up our received wisdom about what these terms mean and how we use them. I'm interested in less a theoretical purity or getting ideas right, as I am how they sort of like propel us into new conversations moving forward. And then I call this messiness of domain, and thinking about the book and my work as moving across, you know, fan studies, discourse studies, game studies, which is really like media studies and platform studies, and thinking about technology and representation and all of these sort of like different things through a humanities lens, right? Slipping across these boundaries, which of course leads to the relationship between surface and depth, which is what I'm ultimately interested in, trying to hold this entire huge conglomerate of objects and actions and things that we call gaming, and trying to sort of like make sense of them as a unit rather than focusing on any one thing in particular. Gamer's the other keyword in the title. And I have to confess, you know, what the gamer means to me is different from what I think gamer means to a lot of people. I come at it from a very sort of personal identity. I come to it from the knowledge that we have a particular image or fantasy about what a gamer is. But ultimately, I'm actually less interested in gamers themselves, and more interested in thinking about the apparatus around the person playing a game that might or might not make them a gamer, if that makes sense. So this is political systems, technological systems, cultural, and et cetera. Very briefly, because I do want us to get to, I have a couple of provocations, and then I love the conversation part of these events the most. You know, I've organized or tackled these sort of like troublemaking tasks across different domains, right? So the chapter of Dick Wolves and Killjoys, Feminism and Interpretative Violence in Gaming Communities, looks at discourse not only within gaming communities. So one that we would recognize, of course, is Gamergate. That's where this kind of work became really visible to the mainstream. But of course, harassment in gaming environments has been happening forever, since the advent of gaming, right? And so I was situating it within this chapter on the Dick Wolves incident that happened around 2010 or so, preceded Gamergate, but another sort of like instance of folks harassing feminist critics of video games. But instead of focusing only on fans, right, behaving badly, which is what a thing that academics tend to do, I connect that conversation and the sort of like boundary creating around the notion of the gamer and how you can really read a game, and extend that to academia, right? We have our own sort of norms and standards and expectations of what it means to or what it should mean to read a game, right? So returning to narratology versus ludology and other sort of like disciplinary arguments and conversations, I really want to make aware that like the stuff that we like to blame fans for that is toxic about gamer culture actually is deeply embedded within academic structures as well, right? We can pretend to be sort of more logical, less emotional, et cetera, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of the same feelings going on there and boundary making. Making a Face is a chapter about character animation, right? And thinking about why as our technologies get more and more sophisticated, we continue to ground them in like literally 19th century physiognomy and racial science, right? Thinking about the face as a sort of like quantifiable, measurable thing. I'm interested in this chapter to pick apart how the technical systems of gaming, even though we think of them as advanced, just continue to keep us in a sort of like regressive place. Gender power in the gamic gaze. I take on the concept of the male gaze and thinking about the received wisdom of games like Portal and Bayonetta, right? Portal as being held up as this really feminist revolutionary text, and Bayonetta often the anti-feminist, and I sort of like swap the readings on those and try to think about what about these characters, or why the sort of visual representations of these characters lead us to believe that their politics are aligned in a particular way. And so, you know, troublemaking in that sense of just kind of trying to get people to rethink what we consider a feminist text, for example. Does anyone really identify with FemShep? Is where I sort of bring these domains together, discourse, technology, and representation, and try to think through what are, you know, the political possibilities in gaming, particularly around the notion of like identifying with characters. We have so many ideas about, you know, what it means to represent characters and then play as them. And I'm really interested in maintaining the friction between identity of the player and identity of the character, and how that does and does not sort of translate across domains. Ultimately, I kind of land on, you know, Black feminist queer theorist Kara Keeling thinking about the notion of I equal another, or the idea that, you know, appropriation is something that we risk when we're really trying to bridge the gap between identities and communities, right? And she's working specifically with an Audre Lorde who tells us that like, this is necessarily going to result in conflict. And we need to not just be okay with that, but be able to navigate it in ways that do not result in a sort of like peaceful, we're just going to agree not to talk about this. And, you know, that I sort of extend that in playing the long game and thinking about what the nature of conflict is in our sort of like current political moment. In terms of, you know, we call this conversation reality is radical. And I just, you know, after sort of giving the rundown of my book and keeping in mind the sorts of things that I've been working on and interested in through that work, I ended up on the question, like, is reality radical? Like, really? And, you know, these are the sort of things that I'm going to toss out and try to make trouble for our conversation here. The games industry is hopelessly bound up in capitalism, colonialism, and the military, or the military industrial media entertainment network, as James Jordarian calls it. I'm going to let Bo talk about, you know, how indie games fit into this, but I think, you know, there's an interesting way in which, I don't know, that leaves me sort of hopeless about games, and I've seen it floated around on Twitter. Folks who say things like, the more I learn about, the more I study games, the more I think that we should just like not play them at all. of course, I am going to still keep playing video games. So, you know, what does that mean? Queerness is increasingly co-opted by imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist, cis heteropatriarchy, as are most radical movements, right? So how do we continue? I mean, we have to continue to resist. But what does that resistance mean as the system is more and more adept at picking that up and commodifying it, for example? And whoops, I missed a word. The more we succeed as scholars or indie game designers, the more we are disciplined by the expectations of academia and the industry. And this sort of circles around to my idea of, or my question about like, am I doing justice wrong? I am situated within a rather prestigious university in the United States. That's, you know, a Jesuit university run by the literal patriarchy. And, you know, what space do I have, you know, as someone who is sustained by the system for, you know, breaking it apart within or for creating radical possibilities? That's an open question for me and for all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the share and turn it over to Bo.
Awesome, thanks so much. Here, let me open up my slides. Hopefully it's this window. Let's see, are you seeing a set of slides that starts with reality is radical? I accidentally did a presentation the other day where I was sharing something, I don't know what, I think my email for a while. That was not good. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to Joe for the invitation. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be in conversation with you, with Amanda. As Amanda was saying, I'm always really thrilled to get to be in conversation with them. It's an anecdote that I like to tell to my grad students that Amanda and I first met when we were both grad students within the UC system. And we're both working on queerness in games at a time when there was not this kind of momentum, there was not this kind of visibility. And at least one of our mentors said, we should not be friends, we should not collaborate, we should not support each other because there was only room for one of us. And one of the kinds of trouble that has been really deeply important to me is to say, screw that and screw that thinking, and to find the people who you have these affinities with and to collaborate and to support one another. And it's very trippy and also very, in some strange way, cool that Amanda and I both hold positions, have been lucky enough to hold these tenure track positions and to be bringing this work into the world. So it's really wonderful to be in conversation. So again, I'm Bo Ruberg. I am an assistant professor in the Film and Media Studies department at UC Irvine. I also see lots of friends and collaborators here in the audience, which is wonderful. You may hear some things you know already, but hopefully there's some more for us to dig into. So I think what I'm going to do is kind of give you an overview of the work that I do, tell you a little bit about some of the more recent things I've been working on, and then end with some provocations. So this is me. As was mentioned at the start, as Alex mentioned, I am one of the co-directors of a lab called the CATS Lab at UC Irvine, which stands for Critical Approaches to Technology and the Social. You can see in this image my collaborators, and I co-run this with Erin Trammell and our grad students. Some of us are here with us today. So I'd just like to point this out.
Sorry to interrupt. I think it might not be the right slide.
Damn it, see, it's happening again.
I think we're seeing it, but not in the present view.
Somehow always. Okay, let me try this one more time. Okay, are you now seeing a slide that's got me and some awesome people on it? Yes. Okay. Thank you. So these are some of the folks in the CATS Lab. I just point that out to say that the work that I'm telling you about today very much happens in collaboration, is very much about not just other faculty, but also grad students as well, doing amazing work in this area. It also comes fundamentally from a place of collaboration and community support that goes across academia and game making. So I've been involved for the last 8 years now, that is a long time, with this event called the Queerness in Games Conference. We call it QGCon for short. And it's an event that brings together about 300 people roughly annually. We just kind of take over a building in an academic institution, and it's half game designers and half games academics. And all folks who are invested in exploring queer issues, trans issues. So that's been really fundamental to the way that I think about this work, is to kind of be pushing outside of the bounds of academia and to think about how to share resources and share ideas across those boundaries. These are some of the books that I've worked on, and I put them up here. I really like the colors together. That's not why they're all here together, but as you might imagine, I'm a sucker for anything that's like rainbow colored. I bring them up here side by side because I think they represent some different approaches to doing the work of queer game studies. So the book that you see on the left, Video Games Have Always Been Queer, is a theory-based book. So it takes different queer theory texts and it argues that we can apply them to video games. And that when we talk about queer issues, we're not just talking about representation, we're not just talking about LGBT folks we see on screen, but that actually we can kind of lay claim to the entire medium of video games if we use this queer conceptual thinking, this queer radical thinking to reimagine games themselves. The middle project is an edited volume that I edited with Adrian Shaw, who's at Temple. And this is a project that brings together lots of different authors. So we have academics and journalists, but it's a collection that thinks about queerness and games together from all those different perspectives. And then the third one, the Queer Games Avant-Garde, which is my most recent book, is really about queer indie game makers. So it's about this kind of vibrant current network of queer and trans folks who are making these kind of experimental, scrappy games that are really pushing what we can think of as this medium of video games. So the idea there methodologically and kind of ethically is that it's not just about me sitting alone in a room saying some things about what games mean, but instead kind of turning to the voices of the people who are really on the front lines of making this work. So just to give you kind of a taste of what this work looks like in action. So that first project I mentioned, Video Games Have Always Been Queer, the one that takes queer thinking and reimagines video games. There are lots of different ways to do that work. And it's something that I really love doing. I find it very playful. I find it very like transgressive in the best possible way. It's like an academic playground to me. So it's a chance to think about games we might not normally bring into these conversations. For example, one of my favorite games, some of you have heard me talk about before, is Octodad. I think I have my Octodad on my shelf behind me. So this is a game that appears just sort of silly and fun. It's a largely physics-based game where you are an octopus kind of poured into this business suit. You are trying to just seem like you're a normal human dad. But if we read it through a queer lens, it starts to be a game about passing and about trying to pass as a straight, cis, white human father in this very normative landscape. Some of the more recent work I've been doing is looking at things like queer sex in Nintendogs, which seems like a strange thing to do, but is looking at places where queerness seems entirely absent. But actually we can find it there. So Nintendogs is a game, it's a pet simulator game, a kind of early, very influential pet simulator game that involves a whole community of men who you don't see on screen, walking their dogs and having these kind of random encounters while walking their dogs. So thinking about that instead as a game about cruising. And then thinking about things like glitches too. So the image you're seeing here is from Smash Brothers Ultimate. It's a glitch, the Isabelle Assist Trophy glitch, that just turns this game into chaos. So it spawns all of these characters, they take over the screen. So building from other folks in queer game studies who've thought about glitches to think about what happens when games break down and become kind of joyful and apocalyptic, which you'll see more of in a sec. On that queer indie front, there is tons of work out there to explore some of the things that are in this project that I mentioned, run the range. So you have work like Robert Yang's games, which are much more sexually explicit, often feature sex between men, games like Rinse and Repeat, to everything like Jess Marcotte's work, which often is a kind of combination of tangible and digital. This is Rustle Your Leaves to Me Softly, which I love, which is an ASMR plant dating sim. So you are engaging in these intimate relationships with plants by touching them, which is being picked up and then becomes part of the gameplay. So I really love how work like this shows us just a full range of different ways that queerness might be brought into the design process and design of games itself. So more recently, the project that I have been digging into, this has been my, strangely enough, my happy place for a little while now, is thinking about queer apocalypses and post-apocalypses in games. So it's a thread that I saw when I was doing the queer games avant-garde work, that there was kind of this dichotomy where some people were thinking about making queer games as a way to make a better future. So this goes back to Jane McGonigal's work, like Reality is Broken, the idea that you can kind of fix things through game making. But there was also this other side, and I think it's actually coming out more and more, which is we're seeing apocalypses in queer games, both at the indie scale and the larger scale, like the AAA scale. And I'm so fascinated by that because I think of this as a chance to kind of destroy the world as we know it, and consider the fact that in order to create worlds that may be more just for queer folks, for trans folks, it's intersectional as well for people of color, that we may need to blow up the world and start it again. And there's some very real stakes to that at the moment, right? We're in this time where that feels apocalyptic in a very real way. So what does it mean in the face of that to create queer work that plays with the apocalypse? So some of the things that I've been looking at range from Misha Cardenas has a recently new VR experience called Sin Soul, Gender Wrecked by Ryan Rose, to things like Hotiful Boyfriend, which is a pigeon dating sim, which is also, it turns out, post-apocalyptic. So as normal, you can see my interest range from the somewhat serious to the silly and the playful. I've also been doing a lot of work in the last few years on gender and sexuality in live streaming. So I know a few of my collaborators are here at the moment. So this has definitely been done with grad students. And the idea here is to look at how these issues of queerness, but also femphobia and harassment and all of these things are coming to a different kind of platform, which is this platform where people are playing games live and performing games. So a lot of my interest has to do with thinking about parallels between games, game live streaming, and webcam modeling and kind of online sex work. So you can see here juxtaposed just from when I took these screenshots a couple of days ago, the browse screen for Twitch and the homepage for Chatterbait. And you can start to see just the similarities between platform and structure, but there's a lot to explore there. So I'll close by giving some provocations. This comes from the introduction to a special issue that I co-edited with Amanda. This is our editor's introduction. It was a special issue in game studies, so one of the longest established, most kind of respected and visible game studies journals. It was the first time they had featured queer work at this scale. It was a large special issue. To be honest, one of the things that was really cool about it is that all the pieces, all the articles went through rigorous peer review, but our introduction, we were able to sneak things in. We were able to say the things I think we really wanted to say in a much more frank way. So it's one of my favorite pieces I've ever had the pleasure of working on because I think Amanda's troublemaking and audacity, and I say that in like the best possible way, really helps bring that out in me too. So I just want to read you a little bit of this to close. So this piece was called Not Gay as in Happy, Queer Resistance and Video Games. So the idea here is to think about, when we talk about queerness in games, how does it not get co-opted into normative systems, exploitative systems? How do we find the radical potential? How do we keep the radical potential? So we wrote, the place where queerness meets games is a site of radical potential. At the intersection stands the invitation to radically reimagine games and play. We are standing now in the midst of a crucial shift in the relationship between games and queerness. This is not because mainstream video games are becoming more diverse, because the game industry is becoming more inclusive, as many have enthusiastically claimed. It is because queer people are destabilizing and re-envisioning games from the bottom up. The forms of identity, desire, and intimacy and disruption that we are drawn to in games are not surface level representations of difference. They do not promise to make the cultural landscape of video games a more diverse place, nor do they strive simply for increased representation and inclusion, drawing marginalized subjects into existing hegemonies. Instead, they challenge norms. They long for queer worlds. They also remain skeptical of homonormativity, homonationalism, reappropriation, remarginalization, and exploitation. The modes of queerness in games that we are interested in are not gay as in happy, they're queer as in resist. So I'll leave things there. Thank you so much, and I look forward to our conversation.
thank you so much. Absolutely amazing and fascinating, and I'm filled with questions, but I think that we should sort of open it up. But I think there are enough of us that the best way of doing that would be if people could think of their questions and pop them in the chat, and I will do my best to kind of pick through and convey questions to the two speakers. While people are thinking, I have so many things I could ask, but the thing that's popped to mind at the top of my head, you said you haven't played Hades. Have you played Hades yet?
I said that to you like 3 days ago.
Yeah.
No, I haven't played Hades yet.
I have
Amanda,
played a lot
you have
of Hades.
played Hades.
A lot of Hades.
So can you tell us about Hades, and can you tell us about dying in Hades?
Sure. And actually, it's funny that you should ask. I'm not sure if I told you this before, but my next book project is on death in games. And you know, death as representation, but also as mechanics. And so Hades is really it was really good timing in that way. Although I'm going to say this, I still prefer The Binding of Isaac to Hades for reasons that I will happily argue with folks about. The representation in Hades is great, but you know, I'm a mechanics boy at heart. So, but one of the things that Hades does that makes death more palatable, like all games use death as a disciplinary mechanism, right? You have to die to get better at games, and you basically like play, die, and repeat over and over and over again. Hades actually builds in more rewards to dying than most other games have. And I would say, again, I love it for the queer representation, but I actually don't think that part of Hades is that radical in a way, or even that particularly interesting. But what it does is it keeps people who are not like me, who are really sort of obsessive about getting it right and will play over and over and over again, a bit more entertained and along for the ride, right? So you get little tiny snippets of like story every time you die, and you go back and, you know, somebody will declare their love for you, or, you know, you get a little bit more of the hot tea, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and I'm happy for folks to disagree with me, because I feel like this is not a terribly popular opinion. But yeah, I mean, I think Hades more overtly rewards death than other games, but it is still the same kind of death cycle that I see operating in most games.
There's that interesting distinction, isn't there, between understanding failure as something we want because it is implicated in eventual success, and understanding failure in this, or failure and death in this kind of much broader way. And when I think about Hades, I don't care if I ever win or lose that game. It's not that it doesn't have goals, but those goals are much kind of more varied and plural texture. I wonder, actually, is dying failure in Hades? It's a game that's been... No, you're shaking your head.
No, dying isn't failure in Hades. Like, you're supposed to die, and the only way you're going to get all of the story content, and particularly like all of the queer stuff that everyone's interested in Hades, you only get that by repeatedly dying over and over and over again. And like, you get that the quickest way by intentionally not succeeding at the game, right? So just get killed in the first room so that you can go back and like see more of these conversations.
I've seen somebody beat it on their first go. There's a question from a real person. So Ruth is asking, hi Ruth, by the way. I'd like to ask if you two are happy to speak more about the idea of queerness and the connection with apocalypses and the notion of glitching and breaking the game. And there's a context there. Ruth's recently been working creatively on the notion of social narratives as entwined with game narratives that are embodied in the navigation of space, including the queerness of speedrunning and breaking the game.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, thanks so much for your question, Ruth. So glitches, I think, are really interesting. There's a little bit of a history within this working on queerness in games, of folks thinking about glitches as queer. We start to see the structures, the internal structures of tech. And I'm kind of interested actually in shifting that and thinking about the glitch as increasingly ephemeral. So for example, that glitch that I mentioned in Ultimate, because we're now in an era of constantly updating content, it got patched really quickly. So like I saw that there's a version of it where it just like spawns 1 million dogs from Nintendogs and they lick the screen. It's like the most grotesque, queer shit ever. And I loved it. And then by the time I went to really dig into it, it had been patched and it was gone, right? And so it only exists in this kind of secondary fan documentation. So that's, for me, that's what's interesting, is kind of moving the conversation beyond glitch as, you know, radical break in the system, and thinking like what the limits of that might be. I don't know for you, Amanda, if that brings up anything.
Yeah, I mentioned in the chat with Pal's recent new article. I didn't get to type it out yet, but a trans historiography of glitches and errors, which just came out in Feminist Media Histories. And one of the things I appreciated in that article was the way that Pal distinguishes between the glitch and the error, right? The error as something that is sort of like foreseeable by the system and in some way accounted for in the system. And so they use the example of like error messages that like actually anticipate the software breaking in a particular way, versus the glitch, which they position as something that happens outside of the system itself, or outside of the bounds of the imagination of the system. And this is one thing, you know, what you've been saying about sort of getting away from talking about glitches in a particular way. I also feel this way about failure, right? And this is why I'm so interested in the Hades boners, because for me, like there's failure and there's failure, right? If failure is built into your system as actually a condition of success, like, are you really failing at it? In the same way that I think the glitch and the error like helps me articulate that, right? If your system is anticipating you behaving in this way at some point, are you really doing something that is about like radical possibility, right? I don't know. In the same way that like when you write about failure, one of the first things I remember about that first failure article that you wrote was the thing about like, I'm playing Mario Kart badly, right? I'm running around the wrong way on the track. Although recently I saw somebody post a YouTube video about like they won by going the wrong way or something. I don't know. But like doing things in ways that are not intentioned, for example. For me, that has more radical possibility in it than having queer characters that are only unlockable if you fail the game.
There's probably an interesting link actually with the next question here, which is about a system that potentially anticipates certain forms of failure and not other forms of failure, and which has ways of recuperating and integrating some of those failures and not others. And that's academia. That's what you were talking about, the scholarly system. And Josephine asks, I wonder if there is a queer way to game the scholarly system, perhaps to collaborate and make space for each other in a way that we're often not encouraged to do within a competitive system. Can we queerly play academia? What do we think?
I feel like both of our faces just we were like, ah.
We're trying, right? And I think the baby steps towards that are, again, embracing collaboration, especially with folks that you're meant to be competitive with, right? Or in embracing sort of irreconcilable approaches to games, and trying to hold them up side by side as like, equally valid, right? We have a real problem with accepting like a wide range of equally valid approaches to games, which is, you know, the whole sort of thing behind narratology versus ludology, but it's also the whole logic behind like rigor, right? Scholarly rigor, as you must approach things in this particular systematically approved way in order to gain that kind of cred, right? There are lots of complicated conversations we could have about scholarly rigor, but I think, you know, my attempt to queer has been one to just collaborate promiscuously, as it were. You know, I had a feminist studies professor. Her name was Eileen Boris when I was a graduate student. And she said something during class that I always remember, in part because like the caricature of the performance, she's like very small, you know, lady, but she's like, you always, always, always use institutional resources for radical ends, right? And so I'm always sort of like thinking about how can I mean, you know, I sit on a pot of research money at Georgetown. Like, how do I trick the accountants, and I know this is being recorded, but how do I like funnel the money in other directions, right? Legitimate research resources, but can I use that money to translate articles? Can I use it to like, I don't know, get a grad student a hotel room? You know, all of these different ways that like, if you have the resources, you need to be like flinging it at people who need it more.
Yeah, I agree with a ton of that. I mean, it's something I wrestle with a lot because like, as you move up through a tenure track position, like I do not want to take that for granted in any way, but I just think about how you become, like, even despite your best efforts, you become part of that system. And like, Amanda and I are both up for tenure this year. Like we're like becoming more and more part of it. But for me, a huge part, in addition to collaboration, is work with grad students. It's something that's been very important to me since I had started at UCI. Some of my grad students are here, and part of it's about funneling resources whenever there are resources to give. But for me, it's also affective. Like so I went to Berkeley for my PhD, and it was very, my home department was very cold, like super smart, but a sense that you don't tell people about how you feel and you don't show weakness. And what I try to do for grad students, hopefully successfully, is to be a person who is open to talking about feelings and messiness and what is hard, and to be vulnerable and to be dorky, and to show that that is a very valid way to be a person coming up into academia. And my hope is that that creates a space to support people who literally identify as queer, but also to kind of shift norms and values and expectations.
And if we have time for one more question, Sam, who's actually a co-host, so like Ariel, he has a voice, has one question that he would like to ask. Sam, do you want to come on?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I'm also going dark here as well, so excuse the blackout that's happening. I was just intrigued that you raised this question of discipline and being disciplined, and the kind of the different ambivalence of that term. And I was intrigued by this question of a kind of queer radical future in some way, and what people get really good at through the very kind of minute, fast twitch discipline of gaming, as well as its imaginative content. And there's a sort of maybe it's an unhelpful question, but just thinking about what we might get very good at in terms of being able to create futures in some sort of way that expresses that solidarity you just discussed through gaming as a mechanism. But then the ambivalence comes in with the sense that kind of audit cultures and managerialism is being ever more ramped up, and itself is undertaking its own kind of gamification turn, I think, which will put more and more boundaries, I think, on academic life probably. I just wanted to introduce that ambivalence.
You're better at games than I am, Amanda, so you should talk.
Wow, you're better at academia than I am, though. So I guess, you know, thinking about this sort of like double bind of disciplinarity, I actually have a lot of internal turmoil about, as I mentioned, like a concept like rigor, right? Because we see, I'm aware in particular of like the shifting goalposts, right? Especially for scholars of color, right? So that once you see really rigorous, scholarly rigorous sort of work coming out, all of a sudden we're sort of like shifting our practices in a different direction, right? In an attempt to be more accessible. I also believe that it is important to understand history and like where knowledge is coming from in order to make any sort of meaningful interventions, right? And so like trying to strike this balance between like there are actually practices in scholarly disciplinarity that are important to build a particular kind of foundation versus the ways that that then is used as a gatekeeping mechanism. I still have not sort of resolved this for myself, and sort of like resolved, you know, how that looks out in the wild, as it were. I agree 100% that like the gamification of the university is underway, right? Linked to the gamification of capital, like capitalism is a game, right? And this is why universities have been shifted in this direction. The question of like getting good at it, I think a lot of times we convince ourselves that the more power we can accumulate as we move up in these systems, the more we'll be able to change them from within. That has yet to be determined, right? So we can do sort of local things like intervening in tenure cases, for example, trying to get a wider variety of work recognized, mentoring and advocating for marginalized scholars. Like we can and should do all of that work. But I still think it's a big open question as to, you know, whether that means anything, right? I think of Sarah Ahmed in particular, right, who's done so much work on disciplinarity, on institutionality in universities, who left the academy, right? She straight up left academia and said, like, this shit is too broken, right? And the more that, you know, the more that she was bumping up into the walls, the more she found like walls were just being built around all of her complaints or whatever. And so, I don't know. I don't have a like a good answer to that. I just know that it's a really thorny problem, and then I think it's an ethical imperative for especially folks who are tenure line scholars, who are attaining tenure. You know, Bo and I are still early career, technically precarious in a certain way, but like we're not precarious in the way that other folks in academia are precarious, and so it's on us to start rattling the cage a little bit.
And with that absolutely fantastic ending, I think it's time to really thank our speakers. And I wonder if I can just do this. So I'm trying to unmute everybody. Is everybody getting an unmute?
Yes.
Yes.
Why don't we try and make a noise? Thank you, guys. It has been really, really wonderful. And I hope in the spirit of Amanda's comments there at the end, I hope this is also just the beginning of many more connections, conversations, and mutual actions together. But I will thank our speakers. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I dropped a link in the chat where I'll put Twitter links and links to anything else that I can think of that people might find interesting if you want to explore more and get in touch and stay in touch. And with that, thank you, everybody, and take care.